no, that's not good. Today I'm gonna make the cheapest Porsche 911 in the country a bit more modern, but first, I'm gonna get rid of some engine movement. When I installed my Pfister Sports exhaust, a few of you mentioned that the engine mounts looked worn. And since that is one of those while we're in there jobs, let's go ahead and get that replaced. First, I've driven my car onto ramps for more clearance. Now I need to remove the 13mm bolt holding the airbox. I also loosened the hose clamp to the throttle body, allowing that to come off. Then I unclipped the mass airflow sensor and put it out of the way. This includes opening the clip that holds the wire. After moving the oil filler hose, I'm able to take the airbox out to give enough room to work. When moving the oil filler hose, make sure not to break it because that can be a pain to fix. In the 996, one motor mount you can get to now, and the other is covered by a secondary air pump, so that needs to be removed. To remove it involves taking off a 10mm nut and two 10mm bolts. To give them most space, you can also remove the hose to allow for complete removal. It is possible to keep the hose connected and move it around, but it does restrict your access, and it can cause an issue with the hose if you're not careful. Now we need to support the engine with a jack. The jack is placed under the engine using a block of wood to protect it. And since I don't really trust myself, I also used a few jack stands just to be safe. From underneath the car, I could now remove the 18mm nut from each side. They are torqued pretty tightly, so a breaker bar comes in handy. I'm using one that was my grandfather's, but yours doesn't have to be a family heirloom. Once you break the torque, it is easy enough to take off. But make sure that your jack is high enough so the engine doesn't drop too much. At this point, I found out that my cheap 15-inch hydraulic jack just didn't go high enough. So I made a trip to Lowe's to get a jack, and Lowe's isn't a sponsor yet, but they are conveniently located. Once I got a new 3-ton hydraulic floor jack that means serious business, and gave myself a back spasm while doing it. They aren't joking when they say it's a team lift. I was able to get the car lifted to the correct height to finish the job. The jack stands did come in very handy, shifting from one jack to the other, as did using a larger than needed piece of wood. With the car lifted up, I took off the 13mm bolts at the top of the motor mount, then the motor mount came right out. As you can see, the old motor mount is stretched out quite a bit compared to the new, so it is a good thing that I'm replacing them. These new motor mounts are OEM, as I mainly do street driving and let others drive my car at times, so I didn't want the new motor mounts to be too harsh. The new motor mount went in pretty easily, and there is a square connector to help line things up. Once all was in and I jacked up the engine a bit more, I could hand tighten the 18mm nut at the bottom and also hand tighten the 13mm bolts at the top. I then torqued the 13mm bolts to 17 pound-feet, which is what you use for the M8 bolts. I believe the spec is 23 pound-feet if your car uses M10 bolts. But always check the spec if you decide to do this yourself. After all, this is for entertainment purposes only, according to my lawyers. A trick that you may not know is that you can tell if it's an M8 bolt if the threaded part of the bolt fits into an 8mm socket. Once those are torqued to spec, I torqued the 18mm at the bottom to 63 foot-pounds. The process is the same on both sides. Once I did one side, I did the other to help prevent any side-to-side movement of the engine with both mounts removed. Next, I put back on the secondary air pump and the nuts and bolts for that. Then the airbox goes back on in reverse, just how you took it out. And that's the motor mount. But before we go on a test drive, let's try to make this a bit more modern. One of the big differences between a modern car and this one from 1999 is the stereo. Most people probably put in a double DIN unit, but I'm hoping to make things easier to go back to stock if I want. So I'm installing a single DIN unit that offers Apple CarPlay as well as Android Auto. In ordering all the parts, I forgot to get the removal tools. Now I don't recommend this, but a nail file from a pair of nail clippers can be used to remove the stereo if you are impatient. I put the nail file in about an inch and worked to allow it to be free. Unfortunately, nothing happened. So I took off the side trim carefully and unscrewed the AC controls. Then I removed it, allowing for access to the back of the radio. From there, I could use the nail file while pushing from the back, and I was able to free one side and then the other. This probably would have been much easier with the proper tools, but I got it out. To prevent the need of cutting original wiring, I purchased a wiring kit that allowed the original hookups to have the wires that could be connected to the aftermarket wiring. This also provided a hookup to go from the factory amp to RCA cables. Since this head unit only had 2 RCA channels instead of 4, I needed a cable to go from 2 to 1. I then wired things up, making sure not to solder anything yet. You can use a bit of electrical tape at this point just to make sure wires don't touch. I then turned it on to make sure all the wiring worked, and it did, except that it forgot my settings whenever I would turn off the ignition. After some research on the internet, I found out that the yellow and red wires needed to be switched. After fixing this, it would remember the radio settings after the car was turned off. This is important as this particular unit was made in China, and as such it had the Chinese FM radio frequencies as the default. So you'll never get any radio channels if you can't change that. Speaking of the radio, I also needed to install the European radio adapter to make it work with the stereo. Now that everything was working, I soldered all the wiring and used some zip ties to clean things up. For voice commands and phone calls, the radio comes with a microphone. I clipped it near my knee for now, but I'm thinking that I'll eventually relocate it to this spot near the instrument cluster, which is the factory spot for the microphone if you had the hands-free unit. This unit does have a backup camera, but I didn't like the way it looked, so I'm going to look at other options and decide if I'll install one of those at a later date. And now it's time to go on a test drive to make sure that the engine doesn't fall out and the radio works. And in case the engine does fall out, make sure to hit that like button so that the YouTube algorithm can make this go viral and potentially pay for my mistake. But before the test drive, now is a good time to talk about the 70 MAI Dashcam Omni. I live in Florida now, and while when I was in California, there were some terrible drivers, Florida certainly gives them a run for their money. Between the tourists, retirees, snowbirds, and fed-up locals, it can get pretty crazy out there. I mean, if you turn on the TV, every other ad is for an injury attorney. So when you get in an accident, you want proof that it wasn't your fault, and that's where the 70 MAI Dashcam Omni comes in. I was sent this camera to review, and so far, I'm pretty impressed. It offers 360 degrees of recording with motion tracking to capture when you get hit from the front, side, or back. It also has night vision, a mode for while you're parked, and a voice assistant. It has 1080p HD video and even has a preview screen. It even has some fun features like the ability to use voice commands to take photos and even selfies. Hookup is pretty easy and done without wiring. But you also have the option to have it professionally wired, which is required if you want to enable the Parking Guardian mode. They give you a tool to tuck the wiring into the headliner and weather stripping so it's hidden out of sight. It uses an electrostatic piece of plastic that the mounting piece sticks to, so if you ever need to take it off, you can do so without the need to remove sticky residue off of your windshield. Until midnight Pacific time on May 25th, 2023, you can get a 20% discount on the 70 MAI Dashcam Omni, and you'll find all the links you need to purchase in the description. Now to get on the road and try this baby out. The vibration is definitely better. I've already stopped a couple times, and yeah, it's better. There'll probably be a little bit of a break-in period, about a couple thousand miles, and then it should be even better. If not, then I'll probably need to look at replacing the transmission mount soon, but it's definitely better than it was. There used to be a bit of a vibration every time you'd stop, and that's pretty much all gone, so it's much better. Now the radio is another story. It works, but there's this annoying alternator whine that I've got to look at. I'll see what we can do about this alternator whine. Usually it's something like a ground or something like that, but we will see what we can do and make it better, hopefully. I've checked all the grounds and they all look good. I've also tried different ground points and nothing seems to have helped. In a last-ditch effort, I've now just installed a ground loop isolator and the whine is gone. I personally haven't noticed a difference in sound quality, but I've heard that some have noticed a difference, so there isn't a guarantee that it will work perfectly for you. After driving with the new motor mounts a bit, I also wanted to check things and everything overall looks good. Well, until I stepped back and saw a few oil spots. So following that oil, it appears to be coming from this seal. It looks like from moving the car is why there are so many spots. I believe this is the Variocam solenoid and both the front and back may be leaking. So it's time to research the part number and get that taken care of. Unfortunately, that's just gonna have to wait till next time.